Today we are joined by Professor William Gumede. He's a founder and executive chairperson of Democracy Works Foundation. He also serves as an associate professor at the Wits School of Governance, is a #1 best-selling author, and is a long-standing advocate for ethical governance. Professor, thank you very much for joining us today.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to have this conversation with you.
Um, Starting off with most recent news, the ANC recently declared an economic emergency for South Africa and unveiled a 10-point plan for economic recovery. Do you think the characterization of an economic emergency is quite accurate? And how did we get here? And how can we look to get out of it?
The sad part is we have been in economic emergency for quite a while now. And up to now, there's been a denial of the fact that the country's in it's actually in possibly one of its worst economic crisis since modern South African times. So if you just think about this, I'll just take you one metric. Just with the unemployment of 32, 35, 36%, it's an economic emergency. And with a youth unemployment of upwards to 60%, so that's really is an economic emergency, and we should have called that quite a while ago. So, it's coming very, very late. But I think the important thing is, are we tackling the right things? So yes, now there's economic emergency. There is a couple of things that we absolutely need to do to deal with our crisis. And if our plans, or if the government's plans do not respond to the structural issues, it's like blowing in the wind. It's just all talk then. I mean, the first of our structural things really that we absolutely have to deal with is we have to deal with corruption. Seriously with corruption. We can set up the commissions of inquiries, which is often, most of the time is actually to keep the wrongdoing for tabs rather than deal with it. We know exactly what needs to be done. For example, I mean, if one look at the research, so the Second World War, if a country only tackles corruption, let's say our equivalent corruption, take about 20%, reduce corruption in the state with about 22%. That will give us at least about 2-3% growth rate. It will lift the growth rate. That is how important it is to tackle corruption. Unfortunately, a lot of South Africans do not think corruption, they do not take corruption seriously and cannot see how corruption undermines economic growth, undermines the employment creation, increases poverty, and increases lawlessness.
And now that South Africa has entered the new terrain of national coalition government, with a coalition government encompassing wide-ranging, ideologically opposing parties, but under one coalition bloc, could this start to foster ethical leadership, promote accountability, and prevent the recurrence of patronage networks? Or is it more about politics, who's going to keep power at play? How would you assess the progress that's been done by the GNU so far?
The government of national unity actually offers us as South Africans an opportunity, a governance mechanism and a governance structure to lift growth and to deal with our economic problems, and also as a nation-building mechanism. Unfortunately, it hasn't been used well. I mean, and again, it's the ANC is at fault. The ANC has been in power for the last 30 years, and the ANC's political culture has been a culture of a majority-based decision. And in majority-based decision-making, ANC party positions has become the country position. ANC ideologies has become the country policies. Now, to govern effectively, governing parties, even if they have large majorities, must govern in the interest of the citizens and the country, not in the interest of their parties or ideologies or the leaders. Now, the ANC have struggled while being in the government of national unity to transform that majority-based decision-making culture into a consensus-based culture. Government of national unities or grand coalitions cannot work effectively unless it is the decision making in these structures are collaborative, are consensual, and not majority based decision making. And because the ASG has not generally adopted a consensus based decision making, the GNU has struggles to get out of gear because of that. And let me just tell you about consensus-based decision-making. When I was advising the non-ANC partners when they negotiated with the ANC to put the GNU together, I said to them, look, it is important that they insist on the principle of a consensus-based decision-making, even if it means getting less of ministerial portfolios, because consensus-based decision-making is much more important than ministerial positions. Why did I say that? If you look at, after the Second World War, the countries that are done very, very well. When I say done very well, high growth rate for very long periods, stability, um, moving their countries out of poverty to develop country status, whether it is Japan on the one hand, or whether it is a South Korea, or whether it is a Mauritius in Africa. What they use consensus-based decision making. And consensus-based decision making will really look at what is in the interest of the country, what is in the interest of the largest number of people in the country, not what is in the interest, for example, of the majority, because the majority interest is not necessarily the same as the country interest. And a governing party's interest is also not necessarily the interest or the best interest of a country. So consensus-based decision-making has actually been at the heart of economic growth miracles, where it is the examples that I've used is examples out of Asia, but it's also in other parts of the world. The German consensus models after the Second World War. So German economic growth and the German miracle after the Second World War devastation came from consensus-based decision-making. The same with Scandinavian or Sweden, think about Norway, we think about Denmark, the so-called democratic welfare states. They are based on consensual decision-making. A country like Switzerland, and also more recently, countries like Brazil. If you think about Brazil's economic miracle came after the 1990s, after they struggled since the 1950s with military rule. But when they brought in these sort of large, big coalitions, starting in the 90s, based on consensus-based decision-making in the widest interest of all Brazilians, it actually fostered the economic miracle. So we've got a government of national unity, which is the ideal platform to deal with economic emergencies, because what the government of national unity does or offers, it brings together the diversity of political parties, diversity of ideas, diversity of colors, and diversities of capacities. So in a crisis, in an emergency, what one needs to get out of an economic emergency or any other emergency is to use the widest capacity in a country and to be as collaborative as possible. And because to get out of an economic emergency, one party or one leader won't have the capacity to take us as a country out of an economic emergency. Now, for the GNU to be this ideal vehicle, this vehicle that can take us out of this economic emergency, the ANC must be able to use the capacity, willingly use the capacity of the non-ANC partners. They sit with them use their ideas, use their resources. And the ANC must refrain from thinking that it is still the majority party. I mean, often ANC leaders on policy, they argue that the GNU policies ANC policies. No, this is supposed to be a whole new multi-party government with new policies, meaning every ANC policy must be set aside for new policies, which are GNU policies. And of course, sometimes there will be policies that the ANC would agree with the non-ANC partners. Now, well, if that happens, that is good. But naturally, almost most policies would need a collaborative approach and will look different from the agency's old policies. I'll just, I mean, just to give you an example, our foreign policy. Our foreign policy has been one of the reasons also why we have an economic emergency now, because our foreign policy has been driven by the ANC and it has been ideologically focused or ANC party focused or past solidarity focus rather than in the best interest of South Africa. Our foreign policies has not been focused on fostering economic growth or on dealing with unemployment or or on tackling poverty. No, it has been based on satisfying ideology, satisfying the past, and satisfying personal ANC leadership interests. Now, in a GNU, those foreign policies were all supposed to be now changed, and we were supposed to get new GNU foreign policies that supposedly are more pragmatic and more pro-growth policies. And so the GNU is a mechanism, but fortunately, the GNU, the effective functioning of the GNU has been undermined by the ANC's political culture of majority-based decision making, of ideologically based decision making, and also of insisting on continuing with failed anti-growth policies.
And adding on what you say, that we've seen this play out with the from the VAT increase to Bella to clashes on economic policy. And the ANC has long said that its policies are non-negotiable because they label it as transformative, all of it. And what we saw with the VAT saga is that they looked for parties outside of the GNU for support. If this carries on with it when there's the non-negotiable stand being taken, and they are willing to go to parties outside the GNU and not their current partners, do you see it as the GNU being sustainable then?
You know, if the ANC continues to insist on the ANC's party and ideological policies being the country policies, the GNU will become unsustainable. And so on. So the GNU's success depends on the ANC accepting the principle, the key principle that this is not an ANC government, this is a multi-party government, and the ANC policies are not GNU policies, cannot be GNU policies. It must be multi-party policies. Unless the ANC get that and genuinely accept that, the GNU will not be sustainable at all. By the ANC trying to bypass the GNU partners when it disagrees over policy by going to smaller parties outside it, undermine the functioning of the GNU and also will torpedo the GNU. I think it will be very, very important. I mean, you mentioned the fact on transformation policies. We have to reimagine what transformation means and what transformation policies are. Now, and what how should we redefine? We must redefine transformation and transformation policies. So the first part of these transformation policies must be pro-growth. If we don't have growth, we will never be able to transform anything. We transform things to be broken if we continue on the current trajectory. Because the current form of transformation is breaking the country, breaking infrastructure, um, um, reducing growth. So we have to reimagine. So the first thing is we have to look at what is pro, what is, what policies are pro growth. That's the first part of transformation. The second part of transformation, we have to say, um, the education system. How do we improve education? In fact, education must be the number one transformation strategy. Every other transformation strategy must be put aside. Every other transformation strategy. We have to focus on getting quality education. Um, I mean, if we just look at a couple of months ago, the Department of Education came out with frightening statistics that over 500 schools in South Africa do not have mathematics. So this is government schools. Now, if we want to transform, how can we have a school not teaching mathematics? So if education becomes the key driver for for transformation, and that is what I would want, and what all of us as South Africans, we have to make, when we talk transformation, we have to say education, nothing else. And then it would mean, what is a transformative education um, policy look like in our times, in the times of technology, in the times when technology firms are bigger than country economies? What does it mean to transform education? That it will mean that almost every child must in school must do mathematics, or do science, um, and get technical education, and that we have to put all of our resources and all of our energy into that, and put aside all of the other ideological issues. The second frightening statistics that came from the education department was that 2,000 schools out of, we've got about 22,000 schools in the country. 2,000 schools do not have economics training. Now just think about it. In this world where you have to, as an individual, has to make these financial decisions, um, as a family level, as a personal level, as a professional level, as a workplace level, that the schools are schools, that we have 2,000 plus schools that do not have economics as a subject. Um, I mean, the lack of economic education in our schools and also at our higher education institutions is actually undermining economic growth. It is actually one of the reasons why we have high levels of poverty and inequality, and it undermines the so-called transformation. And also, it plays out in our politics also, where people, because we've got a low literacy, economic and financial literacy levels in the country. People might vote for political parties that campaign on economic policies that have failed the last 100 years in most countries. And people vote for political leaders that shout slogans as for economic policies because of our high levels of economic illiteracy in the country. So our high levels of economic illiteracy is now is a constraint on our economic growth, but it's also one of the reasons, or rather, it is potentially put our country in peril politically also, because it means that we have political leaders also who get elected based on lack of economic understanding, lack of understanding of the economy, lack of understanding how businesses work, how the state work, and they'll come up with wild populist policies that do not make sense, and people vote for them in desperation, and then they go and implement these politicians' economic policies as anti-growth that cause more poverty and more harm, and so on. So if we want to get transformation right, we absolutely have to increase the economic literacy of all South Africans. And we cannot have a education system where 2,000 of our schools do not have economics training. And then the last, it's not the last one, but one of the other key um, um, challenge to get transformation right is technical education. Now, developing countries that have done well the last 100 years, they've improved technical education. Our technical education have declined. I mean, we have, as a country since 1994, the ANC government closed down technical high schools, technical colleges, and so on. Um, which has meant that as a country we've produced less engineers, less plumbers, less electricians, and so on. So we are not producing enough people to or technical people to drive economic growth. So even if we, for example, on let's say we get all of the foreign investment into our country, and so on, that could potentially make economic growth possible. We just don't have enough people with a technical education to manage, to sustain any kind of economic growth. Now, I know it looks like a roundabout way of responding to the ANC's and President Cyril Ramaphosa's new economic plans. But if an economic plan does not deal with these issues, so the issue of getting technical education, getting mathematical education, getting economic education, getting that right, secondly, dealing with corruption, and then thirdly, getting competence in the state. Because incompetence is one of the reasons why we also have low growth, because the ANC have deployed its members and cadres to run very complex state entities in the country. And because the ANC has done that, it is really it broke many of our state's entities, and it undermined economic growth and poverty reduction. So that has to be an important part. So any economic reform must bring in competence. And it's not only competence in appointing the people, but competence in appointing contractors and tenders to the state. So we have to bring in merit-based appointments to the state, but also merit-based appointments in appointing contractors to the state. That is absolutely important.
Yes, and a huge part of what your arguments is that of merit-based appointments. And moving on to the 2026 municipal elections, and it's a critical one because these elections are the people who are going to ensure that there's water in your tap, your sewage is treated, there's electricity coming on. You recently wrote that residents must stop voting for political leaders who have never managed anything before. Competence-based voting must become the norm. Could you please expand on that a little bit?
Up to now, many voters vote for their own poverty. They vote to increase their unemployment. They vote to increase poverty in the country, and they vote to get low growth in the country, and they vote for state failure. Why do I say people vote for poverty, and they vote for to get unemployed, and they vote to get no houses, and they vote to remain in poverty, and then they vote for crime, to get more crime, because they vote in people. Number one, often that are criminals. So if you're going to vote for a person who's a criminal, the person is going to bring you crime. If you vote for someone that only has slogans for policies, and you're going to get poverty, and you're going to get unemployment. If you vote for a person whose campaign is only ideology, and ideology that has failed, the last 100 years in other countries, you're going to get poverty. and you going to get more unemployment. And if you're going to vote for a person that is violent, that attack others, use violent speech, you're going to get lawlessness, and you're going to have violence, and you're going to have poverty and unemployment. And if you vote for a person who has never ever run or managed any entity in their life outside governments in a political party, you're going to again vote for state failure and for poverty and unemployment. So it is arms as important. When people vote for people, the first thing that I need to that I have to look. The first criteria is: did the person run any or manage any entity, even if it's a sparse or before? If the person's whole life has been in politics and in government, do not vote for such a person, because such a person will deliver poverty and unemployment and state failure. That is guaranteed, right? And so on. And if you get to vote for someone who's corrupt, such a person is going to bring you unemployment and more poverty and more state failure. So voters must be um, much more discerning and much more conscious about who they vote for if they want their lives and their communities in their towns and villages changed. And people should also not vote for people because people look like them. Competence voting means do not vote for a person just because the person is the same color as you, or because the person speaks the same language as you, or because the person look like you, or because the person has struggle credentials. Vote for competency. What is competency? I have to break out competency. Competency is: have you ever run an entity, a shop, anything outside politics and the state? That's the first part of competency. The second part, um, are you honest? Are you an honest person? Are you not corrupt? That's part of competency. Do you have some graphs of economics, of managing things? That is a competency. Um, do you read? Have you ever read a book in your life? Do you read widely? That is, part of competence. Do you make decisions in the best interest of your community, of your town, and of your country, rather than the interest of one color, one community, one political party, or based on ideological interest? For me, that's a set of competencies that people must look at.
And what we've seen in a lot of councils at a local government level is they're incredibly fragmented. Where in Johannesburg, specifically, a party with maybe one or two seats out of 270 could bring down a current administration. You've spoken about building a tent of a centralist alliance for parties that are pro-constitution, pro-rule of law, ethnically inclusive, and pro-entrepreneur. How and why is that important, and how could that mitigate the chances of what we've seen in Johannesburg, for example, over the years, where we've had 10 mayors in 10 years?
The ANC is on a decline, but there's a real danger that we may get populist parties, like, for example, economic freedom fighters, or Ubuntu Sesame, that type of populist parties, and other populist parties, some of the smaller populist parties, and also parties, gang or crime-based parties, that will take the vacuum of the ANC's decline. So it's going to be very important as a country that we proactively work to try to foster um, a big tent a centrist political center. What I mean by that, if we can get um, political parties that are pro-constitution, they believe in South Africa's diversity and non-racialism, they believe in competence, and that are anti-violence, and believe in entrepreneurship, they believe in business, they believe in the market. If we bring those parties together to collaborate, they can collaborate, whether it is merging or whether it is as coalitions, whether it's a national level or as a local level or at the provincial level. So we put to the margins the populist and the violent parties, and the wild parties, because we've got, some very wild parties, parties that live in la la land, and leaders who live in la la land with ideological policies that do not make sense, that have failed badly in other countries, or they have failed already in towns, and so on. So it is very important that we proactively build a political consensus based on this in South Africa's center, like the center ground of South Africa. I think voters are ready in South Africa. I think the ordinary voter of whatever color in South Africa want, number one, non-violence. They want honest politicians. They want politicians that are competent. They want politicians that care. And they want politicians that have pragmatic policies. So that's the center. But unfortunately, if you look online in South Africa today, you would think that South Africa's political center is populist. The South Africa political center is the criminals. You would think the criminals are in charge in South Africa. Or is the populace, the wild populace, with policies that have failed. I mean, that really has failed everywhere else. And because people don't read and politicians don't read, they come up with the same policies. And so it is important that, for example, in the current GNU, that the GNU becomes one of the incubators for centrist political center. And what do I mean by that? That the non-ANC partners in the GNU today have a caucus, a centrist caucus that is pro-constitution, pro-business, pro-civil society, pro-non-racialism, and pro-competence. And so they work together. And then outside the centrist political parties that are pro-constitution and non-racist and competence-based, and so on, that they also work together. So that by 2029, we have a big tent of pro-constitution parties that can then govern the ANC, sort of the country when the ANC is gone. So that we can keep the populace and the wild populace, like EFF and MK, and other and criminal-based, gangster-based parties, that we keep them to the margins, so that we have from 2029 onwards, a centrist consensus that governs South Africa, that runs South Africa, that dominates South Africa's politics, and they can bring stability, and they can bring a period of boringness in South Africa's politics. When I say boringness into South African politics, a period where we focus not on getting people who we don't have political leaders whose credentials are singing or shouting slogans or shouting outdated anti-business and anti-civil society slogans, or who are what's the word, trying to marginalize people that are not of the same color or the same ethnic group as them. So it is absolutely important that we begin to build that middle ground now, of the middle ground of creating a centrist political center. And as I said, what we need to do is we have to build it inside the GNU, but we also have to build it outside the GNU, so that by 2029, in the 2029 elections, that we could form potentially a big tent centrist national coalition to govern South Africa when the ANC is out.
And my final question is you've long spoken about that, despite the well recorded issues about South Africa's potential. So the parting question is, what makes you optimistic about South Africa?
I think the most of what makes me optimistic about South Africa is the talent that we have in the country. the capacity that we have in the country. But the ANC has been governing South Africa, um, and the ANC has not used South Africa's capacity outside the ANC. The ANC, by deploying cadres to government and by deploying cadre tender companies, the ANC has kept power among itself. Essentially, the NCP is running South Africa at a with a very small capacity, while the rest of the country has almost been run idle. We've got business. If we compare South Africa to our emerging market peers, we've got world-class business. That's capacity that we need to use. If you look at our civil society as a world-class of civil society, that's capacity that we must use. And that makes me excited, and that makes me hopeful. For example, I mean, the obvious thing, if in a new economic plan, there are parts of the state that that has failed and that cannot be changed overnight. But we have business and we have civil society and we have professionals outside the state and outside the agency that can be used. I mean, and so on. And that makes me excited and hopeful. Of course, the sad part of it is the ANC has refused to use the capacity that's outside the ANC, business capacity or civil society capacity or the capacity of professional associations. I mean, that makes me excited. The other part that makes me excited, but despite the fact that the public debate and public discourse seems to be dominated by populistic and by violent people and by gangster people, and by people who are economically illiterate and people who do not read, and people that often think that their village is South Africa, and that they cannot see that South Africa is a diverse society, and they think their opinion is the country's opinion, or their color opinion, or their ideological opinion is the opinion of all South Africans. Despite all of that, um, uh, yeah, our public discourses are dominated by that kind of people and groups. I think the middle ground in South Africa is that the majority of South Africans are still firmly in the center. It's just that the political parties are not appealing to them. So I think there is a silent majority of South Africans. If the political parties offer them sanity, offer them pragmatism, offer them um, policies that make sense, and so on, and offer them a rule of law, um, we could have a force to change South Africa for the good. That makes me positive about the country.
Perfect. Thank you very much. That was Professor William Gumede. Thank you.